Welcome to Philadelphia. Yeah, this happens to be my hometown. The FAF's President CEO, Terry Poley, got a request for us to speak at both the Eastern and Western conferences, and she said to me, you could take Philadelphia, where you live, and I would have to go to Alaska for a week. So being not as dumb as I look, I chose Philadelphia. But it's great to have you in our town. I hope you're spending a lot of money. And please come back and do that again. I want to start by thanking NASBA, Ken, Mark, the leadership for being absolutely great partners with the FAF. Absolutely great partners. Constructive, supportive, and really good friends on top of being great partners. And it really matters a lot to what goes on in Norwalk in the standard setting process to have interested parties who give us good, candid feedback and do so in a very constructive way. So thank you, and everybody who is in the leadership. It's arguably the best partnership we have with associations. So we're very grateful, very grateful. I'm going to actually find out how to work this. Sorry, which way? That one goes? I'm going to talk about two things in the next half hour or so, and the first of which is just to provide a short overview of the Financial Accounting Foundation, because we have found out over time that everybody knows the FASB, many people know the GASB. Who the FAF is, what the FAF does, its mission, its role, its responsibilities is not always that clear, and it's very important to you and your constituencies. Secondly, then I'll spend most of my time talking about this new initiative around private company standard setting, which is very important, very exciting, and arguably, more than arguably, long overdue. And be happy to take questions on any of it at the end if we have a couple of minutes. So let me start with just a quick overview of the FAF. I was asked to take over as the chairman back at the beginning of 2009, a second time around for me. The first time around was back at the end of the 90s. And SEC Chairman Arthur Levitt had an objective of adding investors to the oversight body for the FASB in particular to get a user voice in the conversation. And so, as only Chairman Levitt could do, he called me and said, Jack, it's time for you to serve your country. And I said, yes, sir, but I'm too old to be drafted. And I dodged that bullet at the end of the 60s. And he said, no, you're good. I recommended you to be a trustee at the Financial Accounting Foundation. I said, I'm honored. Thank you. What is it? And I'm not sure he really knew what it was either, but he thought it would be a good thing that I would be there. And what I have found actually in the 3.5 years as chair, on my second time around, that the role and responsibility of the FAF is not as well known as it should be, because the FAF is a very important organization to financial reporting in this country. There's a misconception, and there was, pre the Enron WorldCom problems, that either the AICPA or the FAF were a regulatory body, the accounting firms, but we know that wasn't the case. There are misconceptions about its roles and responsibilities, as I said. So I'll give you just a couple of minutes on that, but start at the highest level. The FAF is a nonprofit entity, really empowered by the SEC with respect to the public company side of things. There's 17 trustees, independent trustees, 14 of which are now, which is a change from the past, I'll call them free agents, best available athletes. There used to be de facto or actual seats for various organizations, and the trustees before my time made a judgment that having at-large trustees for the corporate side of the house was a better model, and I couldn't agree more. There are actually 3 that are appointed with governmental responsibilities. They may be a state and local financial officer or somebody from the user community. But those 17 trustees are charged with overseeing the GASB and the FASB. It's the only role we have, is to be the supervisory body and the empowering body for the standard setting process. And when I talk to people, and my colleagues in the investment business, frankly, who don't know nearly enough about this, they take high quality financial reporting for granted. I talk about that the work of the FAF arguably affects everybody in this country, whether it's an IRA or a pension plan or the quality of your state government's finances. It is affected by what happens at the at the GASB and the FASB, and what happens at the GASB and the FASB is overseen by the FAF. You know, the reality is that we have one objective in Norwalk, and it's to produce high-quality standards for governmental entities, public companies, private companies, nonprofit entities. It's a very straightforward mission. We have nearly identical mission statements for the GASB and the FASB, and one that's overriding but encompassing for the FAF. You know, and the way we look at that in our supervisory capacity, but as the boards look at it in their action-oriented capacity, is around the establishing highly credible, I would argue the most credible in the world, standard-setting processes that are driven by broad participation, lots of voices, and we'll talk about that specifically with regard to private companies, objectivity. You know, when you join one of the standard-setting boards, particularly if you join the FASB, because the GASB is part-time, you join, I describe it as a monastic existence. You give up all of your potential conflicts so that you're as objective as you can be, and the process of due process is driven by objectivity. The one square that's missing here, because it's really assumed, is independence. That the independence of the process is one of the most important things we ensure, and I'll talk about that in a second. And then this is all done with oversight from a group of independent trustees who are just as objective, we hope, in ensuring that the boards do their work as effectively for all of the affected constituents. In a little more direct way, the FAF's responsibilities, the trustees, the board that I'm privileged to chair, we think of our responsibilities in three explicit ways. The first is promoting and protecting independence and integrity of standard setting. This is, you know, you'll read news about Congress having hearings or something else, but one of the brilliant aspects of the way the FASB was set up first and the GASB 26 or 7 years ago, the FASB 40 years ago this year, is they're independent. This is a private sector process. In the FASB's case, overseen by the SEC. In the GASB's case, overseen in a way by a consortium of state and local entities who provide feedback to us. But it's independent of the political process. And that is a very powerful force when, you know, globalization is a big deal, and we see how it happens in other jurisdictions. And the independence that the standard-setting boards in this country have is an incredibly valuable asset. Incredibly valuable asset. And arguably, that's our most important role at the FAF, is to protect that and ensure that they earn it. We have an expression we have instituted in Norwalk, which is independence is not a right, it has to be earned. And I believe the boards live to that well. The second key aspect, and this is very new really in many ways, and in the trustees' responsibility, is to oversee the due process. We've established new processes at the FAF around the idea that we represent you and everybody else who's affected by this, and we want to make sure. So we have a committee that works closely without having anything to do with the actual standards, but overseeing the process to ensure it meets those independent, objective, broad participation. It's a very important enhancement in the standard setting process. And then lastly, like any board of trustees, we have to make sure the money's spent well. The great news for the boards versus when I was on the trustee board a decade ago is they're now independently funded largely. So we don't go hat in hand to constituents and say, please support us, which at least presents an appearance of conflict. Now the FASB is funded through Sarbanes-Oxley fees, and literally just this quarter, the GASB is funded by a user fee on municipal bonds. Tremendous improvement. I don't actually think in the reality, but I think in the perception of independence and objectivity. The last thing, again, like independence on the prior slide, but on this slide, is one of our jobs is also to drive improvement and change, to continue to adapt and evolve in the interest of being better at what they do. And that is a very important role, and it's one of the ways we look at trustee candidates and say, will they be part of the process of making us better, not just maintaining the status quo. Give you just a couple of highlights of change, and we'll go right to the one that's of most interest to this morning. This is just the recent evolution at the FAF, and I pick out four things that are important. The first of which is the Standard Setting Process Oversight Committee. There had never been a formal way for the trustees to ask the questions of how are the boards doing. Surprising to me that there wasn't, to be honest, but this committee is a very hard-working committee who works with the board chairs and the board members to say, tell us about how you are going about your due process. Not what the end result is, that's an independent thing from the boards, but how are you going about it? It's been very constructive. I highlight down in the bottom something called a trustee listening tour. One of the things that I had heard about Norwalk was that there was a dome over it and nothing came in and stuff only came out. And when I became the chair, I asked our trustees to join me on a listening tour to hear from people, affected constituents. When we met with hundreds of people, what do you think of the FASB, the GASB, and the FAF? Fascinating exercise, which informed a strategic plan, which I'll mention in a minute. I mentioned earlier increasing engagement on the trustees with regard to the process itself, and the third item here, coming left to right, is what's called post-implementation review, which is, have the standards that the boards put in place had their intended effect? Are there unintended consequences? We're in a beta stage now. We just issued our first one, which affects a lot of private companies, FIN 48, earlier this year. We have more underway now, and it's a very good process. And it'll evolve and it'll change, but the idea of asking how did we do seems pretty self-evident. We just hadn't done it before. And so it's a very important change. In a similar way right now, for those of you who have anything to do in the governmental world, we are in the midst of finishing an academic study about how the GASB scope, if you will. And it's an important question because there is no SEC in the governmental world. And the question is, how broad should GASB scope be? And there's lots of controversy in the governmental world about that. But important work. And one item I don't have on here, and which we'll turn to right now, is this issue of private company, because one of the loudest things we heard on the listening tour was from some of you, people I got to meet for the first time, then was it's a real challenge for many of the companies that are private to meet the same kind of accounting requirements that a public company finds. We heard it from users as well, from bankers and sureties and private investors saying, you know, I know it costs a lot, but I'm not sure I need everything that I get out of these public company standards. So this issue of private company financial reporting came home to those of us who were on this listening tour loud and clear. And as we put together a strategic plan for the FAF at the end of '09, the beginning of '10, one of the 4 or 5 key issues was to wrestle the issue of private company financial reporting to the ground. Been talked about for a long time, but the point was, let's stop talking and let's start doing something about it. And you know, the challenge is very real, but the challenge is not just a public or a private issue, it's both, right? You think about the kind of challenges that people in the financial reporting environment, preparers, users, and auditors find are things like globalization, right? Even small companies compete in a global environment, have global transactions, and so on. Comparability, public to private, U.S. to international, big challenge. Complexity. Complexity was the single biggest takeaway for me as a new chair of the FAF that I heard from people was financial statements are too complex. GE feels it, and the local $50 million manufacturer feels it, that they're too complex. When you get to the discussion in a little more depth, you say, but the world's pretty complex, and that's true. And that's true. So how do you balance complexity in the business environment with complexity in the financial reporting environment? And then lastly, and very importantly, is user needs. As I said, there's an insatiable appetite for analysts of public companies for information. You know, one of the fun things to watch is a preparer talk to an analyst about information. They want to know everything. The last time you went to the restroom, and you go right down the list, and you talk to the owner of a private company, he says, I want to know how much cash is in the bank. And how do you reconcile those two in one financial reporting infrastructure? So there's a long history. I'll give you the short version of it about private companies with regard to these issues. I'll hit just the ones on the top, frankly. Back in '06, recognizing this issue, the FASB created something called the Private Company Financial Reporting Committee, PCFRC. I'll talk a little bit about lessons learned from that, but we all would be of a consensus that it didn't have the net effect that we had hoped it would. Unfortunately. Useful, but not as useful as it could have been. You know, in 2010, we chartered with the AICPA, another great partner of ours, with NASBA and the FAF, a blue ribbon panel to look at these issues of diverse members, some from your organization, some from the AICPA, beyond that. Very helpful to us. In the beginning of 2011, we appointed a group to look at this issue from the FAF trustees, take all of the inputs we'd received in formal and informal ways, the Blue Ribbon Panel report, and then you know, work off of the lessons learned over all of this work that had been done historically, starting explicitly with the PCFRC and forward. I'll share with you just a few of the highlights that we heard from people like you and others. You know, just specific to the PCFRC, the #1 takeaway with regard to the very committed people who worked on this, have worked on this, was the FASB wasn't engaged with it. And without the FASB engagement, the committee could talk and send comment letters or do something else, but it didn't have the robustness or the net effect it needed. So lack of satisfaction on both the members of the PCFRC, the affected parties, and the FASB in that regard. So hold that lesson in mind when we talk about where we're headed. From the listening tour, clearly there was a feeling that there's a disconnect between FASB focused on public companies and the ability to serve private companies. And from our trustee working group, you know, loud and clear that A, this is an issue that does need to be wrestled to the ground today, and B, we need to do this in a systematic way, and 3, if possible, do it all and still have one gap, interestingly. One gap was an important takeaway. So in October, we issued a preliminary report for comment, and I'll tell you, it's been, for me, one of the great learning experiences. You know, our goals in putting out a report were really the following. We said we wanted to establish a strong body focused on private company issues that had the ability to set its own agenda and to vote on recommendations to the FASB. Importantly, that there would be strong trustee oversight to ensure that we were accomplishing the goals we set out. I mentioned the one gap, two gap issue, which comes up a lot from all sorts of constituent groups. And then a consensus, even people who felt the FASB wasn't doing the job as well as they could for private companies. The goal was to do this within a single definitive standard setter, and that being the FASB. You know, we had tons of feedback, and as I said, a fantastic process. The level of interest and commitment was remarkable. We've got lots of letters. Some were form letters, but a lot of very interesting feedback. I'd say the most important part of this process for the FAF trustee standpoint were roundtables we had, at which I see some familiar faces who were there, and we learned a ton. And the plan that was put out as a straw man evolved from that because of this great input that we received in a very broad way. Focus, and the feedback was on a few critical issues: FASB influence, the structure, tweaks to the way it had been put forth, the ratification process, staffing of this, the strong need for a financial reporting framework, and then oversight as a critical part of it. I encourage you, if you haven't seen it, to go to the website and pull this report off. We issued this formally. We had our trustees meeting a couple of weeks ago, and a couple of days later put out this formal document, the establishment of what's called a Private Company Council. I'll walk you through just the high, but it's an easy-to-read report. We had a communications guy write it, not the accountants, and edited by an investment guy. So if it's a camel, it's my fault. If it's well done, it's the communications guy's doing. But key issues, responsibilities of the PCC. Again, based on, these are words chosen advisedly, based on criteria agreed upon with the FASB. Okay, the PCC will identify issues, deliberate, and vote on proposed modifications to U.S. GAAP for private companies. Importantly, subject to the normal FASB process, if you will, or the we call it the endorsement process. And this will be the primary advisory body to FASB on private company issues. I'll tell you more about its makeup in a second, but it's, as I said at the beginning, it was clear to us on the preliminary work that we needed a definitive body to be the owner of private company issues. You know, membership in terms, there'll be 9 to 12 members. We had a bigger body proposed. The feedback we got strongly was it's too many people, but we need to have broad representation across categories of interested parties. We had a FASB chair. We changed our minds. We were told too much potential FASB influence or the appearance of such. Great change. 3-year terms, and somebody can serve another 2, so potentially 5-year terms on this body. You know, the great part about this is already we have lots of people who've raised their hands, and I'll ask you to come up with ideas later on, but the idea that we would we will select people who can bring a lot to the table and not just in one slice. And then lastly, you know, we went back and forth on should people be compensated, and the feedback we got from the most respected voices we heard was no, this should be important enough that it's not around compensation because you couldn't pay them enough for the time we'll ask from them. You know, meetings and agenda, there will be items will go on the agenda by a 2/3 vote, a supermajority. They'll meet at least 5 times annually, certainly early on. It's going to be a big time commitment. Be open to the public. There'll be administrative meetings if necessary. And then this is a critical part of this. We expect the FASB members to attend all of these meetings. Big learning from the PCFRC experience, that you need the FASB at the table. We have that experience in the EITF and elsewhere. Very important. And the FASB, by the way, I should tell you, is very enthusiastic about that. They think they will learn a lot, and it won't be just about private companies. You know, this is a critical part. So how does change happen? Well, this is an endorsement process. Recommendations will come from the PCC, and the FASB will endorse them or not. The endorsement process will be, you know, from the PCC will produce recommendations with a 2/3 vote. And the FASB endorsement process is like any other vote at the FASB. It's 7 members, it's 4-3 or 7-0, hopefully, on these issues. And this is a twist, and it's one we picked up from the roundtables that we had. You know, FASB time can be a little different than most of our time. And this 60-day expectation is explicit in the PCC charter, that we expect the FASB to respond in 60 days with an endorsement or not. If they endorse, what will happen is this will look like a normal standard setting process for the FASB. They'll go out for due process, come back with a final version. The PCC will then redeliberate. And the point here is once. This is not a circle that never ends. This is a redeliberation. The FASB will make they'll come back to the FASB with an endorsement with a recommendation. The FASB will endorse it by simple majority, and it becomes, and an accounting standards update will be issued. Very straightforward. So it's very much like a normal FASB standard. If the FASB chooses not to endorse, there's 2 things. One, the FASB chair will provide the PCC and thus the trustees with written notice that they're choosing not to endorse. But importantly, we expect them to then outline what changes could result in endorsement. So with the time limit and this process, you can't have a pocket veto by just saying we'll get to it. And the FASB is very comfortable with this. Very comfortable with this. They see the need. In terms of oversight, we've established a trustee committee that is with private company experts. Mac Lahan, who's one of our trustees from Texas, from Weaver LLC, will chair it. And then we have people from the private company world on the committee. And they will be very involved in making sure this gets off to a great start. This is an important point. They'll help hold both the FASB and the PCC accountable for achieving these aggressive goals and ambitious goals we have. You know, there will be ongoing regular reporting to the full board and to the oversight committee, which is a standing committee. And then lastly, after 3 years, we will take a step back and say, big initiative, how did we do? I suspect we will go back into a full kind of roundtable format to ask that, although I hope it's going so well we don't need to, because by acclamation, the PCC is accomplishing what it wants. So who's going to do this? We're accepting nominations till June 30, so there's a little sales pitch here to think of people if you haven't, or yourselves if you're interested. The kind of criteria we're looking at to be on the PCC are background and interest in private company financial reporting as a preparer, as an auditor, as a user. Instead, we met fabulous people, both in our listening tour a few years ago and in this roundtable process. Understanding and respecting conflicting views. We call that judicial temperament in job descriptions. And it's important that people come to the PCC with an idea of what's best for the financial reporting system for private companies, not for me as a user or me as an auditor or me as a preparer. Again, the part of this judicial temperament is considering all evidence and analyzing it objectively. And then lastly, we hope that we'll have people who are, frankly, really good communicators, back and forth with each other. And, you know, to be perfectly blunt, there's a lot of work to be involved here, a lot of work. There's good background work being done to make this a success. I'll just comment on 2 things quickly that the FASB is doing. The first is this decision-making framework for private companies. It's a very important initiative it's really, I'd say, the foundation being built initially on a separate track by the FASB, but now is very much preparatory for the start of the PCC's work. And then secondly, which seems to me, it seemed to me when I first heard it, the definition of a non-public entity. But how hard is that? Well, it's very hard. It's very hard, and it's a challenge because are you quasi-public, are you an SEC reporter, or you go down the list? And so getting that right will be important as before we start issuing any kind of statements. Just so you know, the FASB expects to issue draft decision-making framework for comment as a staff document end of this month or next. And so we hope we'll receive lots of comments and input on it because it will be foundational to the success of the PCC. Here's the schedule. So you know it. We, as I said, have a call for nominations out there for members and chair. We've had people be nominated for members, people be nominated for a chair. So we have lots of nominations already, which we're really pleased with. Great-looking nominees, but we'd encourage you to join in that if you haven't. We would hope to have a chair and most of the members selected by August. We have put ourselves on the hook for an accelerated process here. It's a lot of work to fill out a board of 9 to 12 people who are very busy and who need to go through a formal appointment process by the trustees, but our committees have agreed to make that time available. With any luck, we'll be finished staffing the board by the end of September, and by the 4th quarter, we'll have our first meetings of the PCC. I think that means October 1st. The people in Norwalk think that means December 31st. So we'll see. Yeah, we'll see who wins in that game. But the idea is to have this up, running, staffed at the FASB, and fully populated by the end of the year. And that's an aggressive timeline, but we think we're confident we will meet it, actually. So let me just close with this, which is, this is a sales pitch. If you or people you know and respect are appropriate, in your view, members of the Private Company Council, that's where you send nominations. Bob Kalina is the head of HR. He is the point man on nominations for all of the committees and boards at the FAF. We would love to have your input, because we think it could be, we want to have this first group set the standard for something that will be a permanent part of the fixture of standard setting in this country. I'll close again by thanking you, the leaders of NASBA, for one, the chance to come and talk to you a little bit about this, but two, for your engagement and the insights and inputs you've had to making this process end the way it has so far. We start from here. But as a trustee board, we feel terrific about where we're headed with respect to this very important issue. And the feedback we've received from the report we issued and the final recommendations has been very positive across the spectrum So we're really optimistic about this, but it only works if we have a broadly engaged community. So thank you very much for, again, letting me share this with you.